The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the crystal chandelier that had hung in the Hartwell family dining room for 3 generations. I sat at the far end, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide their trembling, while the family lawyer droned through the legal terminology that would divide my late husband's estate among people who barely tolerated my existence. Margaret Hartwell sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the circumstances, her black Chanel suit armor against the grief that should have been breaking her heart. Her children flanked her, Robert with his perpetual sneer and gambling debts, Victoria with her bitter divorce and prescription pill addiction, and Jonathan whose startup companies failed as reliably as autumn leaves fell. "The house on Beacon Hill goes to Margaret Hartwell," the lawyer announced, his voice echoing in the silence. "The vacation property in Martha's Vineyard, also to Margaret Hartwell. The investment portfolio, to be divided equally among Margaret, Robert, Victoria, and Jonathan Hartwell." My name hadn't been mentioned once. Thomas and I had been married for 5 years, together for 7, but according to his will, a will I'd never seen until today, I might as well have been a casual acquaintance who'd wandered into the wrong meeting. "The art collection," the lawyer continued, "including the original Monet and the collection of Civil War artifacts, goes to Margaret Hartwell, to be distributed at her discretion among family members." I thought about the Monet that hung in Thomas's study, the painting he'd shown me on our 3rd date, explaining how his great-grandfather had purchased it directly from the artist's estate. "One day, this will hang in our home," he'd whispered, pulling me closer as we stood before the shimmering water lilies. "Our children will grow up looking at something beautiful every day. There would be no children now. There would be no home. There would be nothing but the echo of promises that died with Thomas in a twisted wreck of metal and glass on Highway 95. "Finally," the lawyer said, clearing his throat uncomfortably, "Mrs. Claire Hartwell is to receive Thomas's personal effects, clothing, books, and other items of sentimental value, along with his collection of vintage watches." The watches. Thomas had collected them since childhood, each one carefully chosen, meticulously maintained, lovingly displayed in a custom case he'd built himself. They weren't worth much by Hartwell standards, maybe $15,000 total, but they represented every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone he'd celebrated since he was 12 years old. Margaret's laughter shattered the silence like breaking glass. It wasn't the gentle laugh of a grieving mother finding unexpected joy in memory. It was harsh, calculated, designed to cut deep and leave scars. "You're just a stranger," she said, her voice carrying the aristocratic accent she'd cultivated over decades of charity galas and country club luncheons. "You don't deserve anything." Her pale blue eyes fixed on me with the intensity of someone who'd found the perfect target for years of accumulated resentment. 5 years of marriage doesn't make you family. You were never family. The words hit like physical blows, each syllable precisely aimed to inflict maximum damage. Around the table, Thomas's siblings shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke in my defense. They were too busy calculating their shares, too relieved that the outsider had been properly put in her place. I wanted to stand up, to defend myself, to remind them that I'd loved Thomas more than any of them ever had. I wanted to tell them about the nights I'd held him while he cried about his family's coldness, about the dreams we'd shared, about the children we'd planned to raise with more love than the Hartwells had ever shown their own. Instead, I swallowed hard and remained silent. What was the point? Thomas was gone, and with him went any bridge I might have had to these people who saw kindness as weakness and love as a commodity to be traded. I signed the papers they put in front of me, collected the single box of Thomas's belongings they'd grudgingly assembled, and walked out of the Hartwell mansion for what I believed would be the last time. Behind me, I could hear Margaret already discussing plans to redecorate Thomas's childhood bedroom, erasing the last traces of her youngest son, as efficiently as she'd erased his wife. 12 years passed before I saw her again. 12 years of building a life without the Hartwell name, without their money, without their approval. 12 years of discovering who Claire Morrison really was beneath the identity of Thomas's wife. When she finally appeared at my door that rainy October night, Margaret Hartwell looked nothing like the imperious matriarch who'd dismissed me as a stranger. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a worn coat that had seen better years. Her perfectly styled hair hung limp and gray around a face marked by age and something that might have been desperation. "Claire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need your help." I looked at the woman who'd humiliated me, who'd stolen my husband's legacy, who'd denied me even the comfort of grieving among family, and then I smiled. "Hello, Margaret," I said. "Please come in. We have so much to discuss. I met Thomas Hartwell on the worst day of my life, which should have been a sign that our love story would be written in complications and contradictions. I was 28, sitting in the waiting room of Massachusetts General Hospital at 3 a.m, my scrubs still stained with coffee from a 12-hour shift, waiting for news about my father's emergency surgery. Thomas walked in, looking like he'd stepped off the pages of a magazine. Navy wool coat perfectly tailored, dark hair slightly mussed from the October wind, carrying himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. He was there for his grandfather, who'd suffered a stroke during a charity dinner at the Four Seasons. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle despite the exhaustion in his brown eyes. "Are you using this chair?" He gestured to the empty seat beside me in a waiting room that was 2/3 empty. I should have been annoyed. There were plenty of other seats. But something in his expression stopped my reflexive irritation. He looked lost, younger than his 32 years, like a little boy who'd wandered away from his parents at a crowded fair. "My father's been in surgery for 6 hours," I said instead of answering his question. "Brain tumor. They said it could take all night." Thomas sat down heavily, loosening his silk tie with hands that trembled slightly. "Stroke," he said simply. "My grandfather. He was giving a speech about literacy programs, and he just collapsed." We sat in silence for a while, two strangers bonded by the terrible democracy of medical waiting rooms where wealth and status meant nothing compared to the fragile machinery of human hearts and minds. "I'm Thomas," he said eventually. "Claire. What do you do, Claire, besides worry about fathers in the middle of the night?" "I'm a nurse, pediatric ICU." I gestured to my scrubs. "Sorry about the outfit. I came straight from work when they called." Thomas studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize important details. "My grandfather would like you. He always said the most important people are the ones who take care of others when they can't take care of themselves." That's when I knew Thomas Hartwell was different from other wealthy men I'd encountered in my 5 years working at Mass General. He didn't treat service workers like furniture, or speak about his charitable donations as tax strategies. When he talked about his grandfather's literacy programs, his voice carried genuine passion for education and helping children read. We talked until sunrise, sharing stories and fears and hopes while our loved ones fought their battles in operating rooms and intensive care units. My father survived his surgery. Thomas's grandfather didn't. At the funeral 3 days later, I wore my only black dress and sat in the back of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, watching Thomas deliver a eulogy that brought tears to my eyes and made me understand where his compassion came from. His grandfather had raised him after his parents died in a sailing accident when Thomas was 15, teaching him that privilege was responsibility and money was only meaningful when it improved other people's lives. After the service, Thomas found me in the crowd of mourners and took my hand. "My grandfather would have wanted to meet you," he said. "He would have said you have kind eyes." Our courtship was a study in contrasts. Thomas lived in a Back Bay townhouse filled with antiques and original artwork. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge that I shared with 2 roommates and a cat named Fitzgerald. He attended symphony galas and museum openings. I spent my free time reading novels in coffee shops and volunteering at homeless shelters. But somehow, it worked. Thomas was fascinated by my world of late-night conversations with fellow nurses, weekend hikes in the White Mountains, and dinners that cost less than his monthly wine budget. I was drawn to his genuine kindness, his intellectual curiosity, and his complete lack of pretension despite his privileged background. The problems began when he took me home to meet his family. Margaret Hartwell received us in the formal living room of the Beacon Hill mansion, presiding over tea service with the precision of someone who'd turned hospitality into a competitive sport. She was beautiful in the way of women who'd had access to the best of everything: personal trainers, skilled dermatologists, designer clothing that fit perfectly because it was tailored specifically for her body. "So you're a nurse," she said, making my profession sound like a communicable disease. How practical. Thomas's siblings were politely dismissive. Robert, the eldest, was too busy checking his phone to engage in conversation. Victoria made small talk about hospital charity events, while managing to convey that she considered my work admirable in the way that wealthy people admire quaint hobbies. Jonathan barely acknowledged my presence, focused instead on pitching his latest business idea to anyone who would listen. The real test came 6 months later when Thomas proposed. He did it properly, traditionally, asking my father's permission first and presenting me with his grandmother's engagement ring, a vintage Cartier piece that had been in the family for 70 years. Margaret's reaction was swift and devastating. She called Thomas the next morning to inform him that giving me the family ring was inappropriate, and that perhaps we should reconsider the timing of our engagement. "She'll come around," Thomas assured me, holding me close in his townhouse bedroom while rain drummed against the windows. "She just needs time to get to know you." But I already knew that Margaret Hartwell would never accept me. I wasn't from their world, didn't speak their language of subtle insults and carefully coded class distinctions. To Margaret, I would always be the outsider who'd somehow convinced her youngest son to propose with a family heirloom. We married anyway, in a small ceremony at a seaside chapel in Maine with my family, Thomas's friends from law school, and exactly 0 members of the Hartwell clan in attendance. Margaret had claimed a prior engagement, a charity board meeting that couldn't possibly be rescheduled. Thomas pretended it didn't hurt, but I saw how he kept glancing at the empty seats where his family should have been sitting. On our wedding night, he held me while tears soaked into my hair and whispered apologies for his family's coldness. "I love you," he said fiercely. "That's all that matters." For 5 beautiful years, it was enough. We built our life in his townhouse, blending his antiques with my books, his formal dinner parties with my casual gatherings. Thomas continued his legal work with a firm that specialized in nonprofit law, and I transferred to pediatric oncology, finding purpose in helping children fight battles that made family disapproval seem trivial. Margaret maintained her distance, acknowledging me with chilly politeness at mandatory family gatherings while making it clear that I would never be truly welcome. But Thomas's love made me strong enough to endure her disapproval, secure enough to build my identity around our marriage rather than his family's acceptance. Then came the phone call that shattered everything, and I learned that love, no matter how pure, cannot protect us from the random cruelty of fate. The first Christmas after our wedding, I decided to build a bridge. Thomas had spent December 24th staring longingly at his phone, hoping for a call from his mother that never came, and I couldn't watch him pretend that family tradition didn't matter. So on December 23rd of our second year of marriage, I showed up at the Hartwell mansion with homemade cookies and determination. Margaret answered the door herself, clearly surprised to find her daughter-in-law on her doorstep, carrying a tin of gingerbread stars decorated with the precision I usually reserved for measuring children's medications. "Claire," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "How unexpected. I thought you might like these for your Christmas Eve party," I said, offering the tin with a smile that felt only slightly forced. "They're my grandmother's recipe. Thomas loves them." And for a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest hint of softening. She accepted the cookies with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, and I noticed for the first time that she was getting older, that the imperious facade might be covering something more fragile. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, and the invitation was so unexpected that I nearly dropped my purse. We sat in her morning room, surrounded by family photographs spanning 4 generations of Hartwells. Margaret served tea from china so delicate it seemed to whisper when she poured, and we talked about safe topics: the weather, holiday shopping, Thomas's work at the legal clinic. "He's always been idealistic," Margaret said, watching steam rise from her cup. "Even as a child, he wanted to save everyone. Stray cats, injured birds, classmates who were being bullied." She paused, studying my face. "I suppose that's how he found you." It could have been an insult, but something in her tone suggested it might not be. "He found me in a hospital waiting room," I said, both of us scared and alone. Maybe we saved each other. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "His grandfather was the same way, always bringing home wounded creatures, convinced that love could heal anything." Her voice carried a wistfulness I'd never heard before. "Perhaps it can." That afternoon marked the beginning of an uneasy detente. Margaret still didn't approve of me, but she began to tolerate my presence with something approaching civility. She invited us to family dinners, included me in conversations, even asked my opinion on charitable endeavors she was considering. The breakthrough came during our 3rd year of marriage, when Thomas came down with pneumonia that landed him in the hospital for a week. I practically lived in his room, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, monitoring his medications with the obsessive precision of someone who understood how quickly health could deteriorate. Margaret arrived on the 4th day carrying flowers and worry lines I'd never seen before. She found me reading to Thomas from his favorite Dickens novel, my voice hoarse from 3 nights of poor sleep, but determined to keep him entertained during his recovery. "You look terrible," she said, but her tone held concern rather than criticism. "I feel terrible," I admitted, "but he's getting better. His fever broke this morning." Margaret studied her sleeping son, then turned her attention to me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since we'd met. She saw the exhaustion, the dedication, the love that had kept me by Thomas's bedside when I should have been home resting. "Go home," she said quietly. "Shower, eat something, sleep in your own bed. I'll stay with him." "I can't." "Yes, you can." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but underneath it was something new: respect. "I raised 3 children, Claire. I know how to watch over someone I love." When I returned 8 hours later, refreshed and carrying Thomas's favorite soup from a nearby deli, I found Margaret reading to her son from the same Dickens novel, her voice carrying the same careful cadence I'd been using. Thomas was awake, smiling at his mother with surprised delight. "She stayed all night," he told me, squeezing my hand. "Never left the room." That evening, Margaret and I had our first real conversation. We talked about Thomas's childhood, about her fears for his health, about the loneliness of loving someone whose work constantly put them in contact with other people's pain. "I was wrong about you," she said, as visiting hours ended. "You love him the way he deserves to be loved." Completely, without reservation. She paused, gathering words that seemed difficult to speak. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." The next 2 years were golden. Margaret and I developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was definitely more than tolerance. She taught me family recipes and shared stories about Thomas's childhood. I helped her understand his work at the legal clinic and why representing low-income families mattered to him so deeply. She even started joining us for our casual dinner parties, charming my nurse friends with her sophisticated humor and surprising everyone, including herself, by enjoying conversations that didn't revolve around charity committees and social obligations. "You've been good for Thomas," she told me one evening as we cleaned dishes after hosting a dinner for 8. "But you've been good for me too. You've reminded me what this family could be." The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was at work, helping a 7-year-old cancer patient learn to swallow pills that would make her feel worse before they made her feel better, when my supervisor found me and said there had been an accident. Highway 95, south of Boston. A truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel. Thomas's car crushed against a concrete barrier. Emergency responders working for an hour to extract him from the wreckage. He died en route to the hospital, consciousness slipping away before the paramedics could stabilize his injuries. The last words he spoke, according to the EMT who called me, were, "Tell Claire I love her." Margaret arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after I did, her face white with shock, her careful composure finally cracking. We held each other in the emergency room hallway and cried like the world was ending, because for both of us, it was. "He was coming to see me," she whispered against my shoulder. "I called him this morning, said I needed to talk to him about something important. If I hadn't called—" "Don't," I said firmly. "Don't do that to yourself. This wasn't anyone's fault." But I could see in her eyes that she was already building a prison of guilt, already deciding that somehow, some way, Thomas's death was connected to choices she had made. At the funeral, Margaret sat beside me in the front pew, her hand occasionally squeezing mine during the most difficult moments of the service. We were united in grief, bound together by our love for the man we'd both lost. I thought that grief would keep us connected, that shared sorrow might transform our tentative understanding into something deeper and more permanent. I was wrong about many things in those days, but I was most wrong about Margaret Hartwell's capacity for forgiveness, especially when it came to forgiving herself. The first sign that everything had changed came 3 days after the funeral, when I returned to the townhouse Thomas and I had shared, to find the locks changed. I stood on the front steps with my purse and a bag of sympathy casseroles from the neighbors, key refusing to turn in a mechanism that had welcomed me home for 5 years. My phone rang as I contemplated the locked door. Margaret's voice was crisp, professional, stripped of the warmth that had developed between us during Thomas's illness. "Claire, we need to discuss practical matters. The townhouse was in Thomas's name only, which means it's part of his estate. You'll need to make arrangements for your belongings." The words hit like ice water. "Margaret, this is my home. Thomas is dead." The statement was brutal in its simplicity. "And you're not a Hartwell. You never were." I sank onto the front steps, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process the transformation of the woman who'd held my hand at the funeral into this cold stranger. "I don't understand. Yesterday you said—" "Yesterday I was grieving. Today I'm thinking clearly." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions without consultation. "Robert will be by this evening to let you collect your personal items. Anything that belonged to Thomas stays with the family." The line went dead, leaving me sitting on the steps of a home that was no longer mine, surrounded by neighbors who'd watched me water the front garden and bring in groceries, and kiss my husband goodbye every morning for years. Robert arrived at 7 o'clock with a moving truck, and the kind of cold efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first time evicting an unwanted family member. He supervised as workers boxed my clothes, my books, the few pieces of furniture I'd brought to the marriage. Everything else, the antiques Thomas had inherited, the artwork we'd chosen together, even the coffee maker we'd bought on our honeymoon, stayed behind. "Where's the ring?" Robert asked as I packed the last of my jewelry. "What ring?" "Grandmother's engagement ring, the Cartier piece. That stays with the family." I looked down at the vintage diamond that had marked the beginning of my life as Thomas's wife. 5 years of marriage, and now it was being reclaimed like borrowed property returned after a failed rental. "Thomas gave this to me," I said quietly. "Thomas is dead. The ring belongs to the Hartwell family trust." Robert's expression was implacable. "You can remove it voluntarily or we can discuss it with lawyers." I slipped the ring off my finger and placed it in Robert's outstretched palm, watching 5 years of promises disappear into his pocket. My hand felt naked, empty, like part of my identity had been amputated along with the symbol of my marriage. The inheritance meeting came 2 weeks later. a formal proceeding designed to make official what Robert's midnight eviction had already accomplished. I sat at that mahogany table in clothes borrowed from my roommate, my professional wardrobe having been deemed insufficient for the occasion, and listened to my life with Thomas reduced to a few paragraphs of legal terminology. But it was Margaret's laughter that broke something fundamental inside me, not the cruelty of the words themselves, though those cut deep enough, but the deliberate nature of the humiliation. She wanted me to know that the kindness she'd shown during Thomas's illness had been temporary, conditional, revocable at her discretion. "You're just a stranger," she'd said, and I realized she was right. I had never been family to these people. Thomas's love had given me the illusion of belonging, but without him, I was exactly what Margaret claimed, an outsider who'd briefly been tolerated and was now being dismissed. I moved back to Cambridge, to a studio apartment above a used bookstore, where the rent fit my nurse's salary, and the owner didn't ask questions about why a 33-year-old woman was starting over with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. The Hartwells made it clear that my presence was no longer welcome at family events, charitable functions, or any social gathering where they might be forced to acknowledge my existence. Friends who'd known Thomas and me as a couple found themselves in the awkward position of choosing sides, and most chose the side with money, social standing, and the ability to make their own lives complicated. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts in pediatric oncology, where other people's suffering put my own losses into perspective. Children fighting cancer didn't have the luxury of wallowing in self-pity, and their courage shamed me into finding my own resilience. Slowly, painfully, I began building a life that didn't revolve around being Thomas's wife. I took graduate classes in psychology, drawn to the idea of helping people process trauma and loss. I joined a grief counseling group where I met other young widows learning to navigate a world that seemed designed for couples. One of those women, Sarah, became my closest friend. She'd lost her husband to a climbing accident 2 years earlier, and had spent the intervening time discovering who she was beyond the identity of wife. Sarah was fierce, funny, and unimpressed by social hierarchies that prioritized bloodlines over character. "They did you a favor," she said one evening as we shared wine and take-out Chinese food in my tiny apartment. "Better to know now that they're shallow, petty people than waste years trying to win their approval." Intellectually, I knew she was right. But emotionally, I struggled with the loss of not just Thomas, but the entire life we'd built together. The Hartwells had erased me so completely that it was as if my marriage had never existed, as if 5 years of love and shared dreams had been nothing more than a temporary arrangement. The hardest part was the isolation. Boston's social circles were smaller than people realized, and the Hartwell name carried enough weight to make me persona non grata at events, restaurants, and cultural institutions where Thomas and I had been regulars. I learned to avoid the symphony, the museum galas, even certain neighborhoods where I might encounter people who knew my story and preferred the Hartwell version to my own. Years passed. I finished my master's degree in counseling psychology and opened a small private practice specializing in grief counseling and family therapy. My work became my passion, helping other people navigate the complex emotions that come with loss, betrayal, and the challenge of rebuilding identity after trauma. I dated occasionally, but no relationship survived the comparison to what I'd had with Thomas. Not because he'd been perfect, no one is, but because what we'd shared had been real in a way that felt increasingly rare. Most men I met seemed interested in the idea of me, rather than the reality, drawn to the romance of helping a tragic widow heal, rather than engaging with the actual person I'd become. By the time 12 years had passed, I'd built a life I was genuinely proud of. My practice was thriving, my friendships were deep and authentic, and I'd found peace with my own company in a way that surprised me. I lived in a Victorian house I'd bought and renovated myself, surrounded by books and art that reflected my own taste rather than inherited family traditions. I thought about Thomas often, but the sharp edge of grief had softened into something more manageable, a permanent sadness that no longer controlled my daily choices. I'd learned to carry his memory without being crushed by its weight. The Hartwells had become distant figures in my mental landscape, people I occasionally glimpsed in newspaper society pages, but who had no actual relevance to my current life. Margaret had gotten what she wanted, a family purged of outsiders, her son's memory preserved without the complication of his inappropriate wife, which is why, when she appeared at my door that October night, I almost didn't recognize the woman who'd once dismissed me as a stranger. This version of Margaret Hartwell looked like she'd learned what it meant to be powerless, and the lesson hadn't been kind. The bookstore below my apartment became my sanctuary during those first months of rebuilding. Mrs. Chen, the elderly owner, Never asked why I spent hours wandering between the stacks, or why I sometimes emerged from the philosophy section with red eyes and tissues clutched in my fist. She simply nodded when I paid for another cup of tea, and occasionally recommended novels she thought might distract me from whatever pain had driven me to seek solace among strangers' words. Grief is like learning a new language, she told me one rainy afternoon as I browsed the self-help section with desperate intensity. At first, everything sounds foreign, incomprehensible, but eventually, you become fluent in loss, and that fluency becomes its own form of strength. Mrs. Chen had lost her husband in the Vietnam War and her eldest son to cancer, so she spoke about grief with the authority of someone who'd survived multiple devastations. Her wisdom, dispensed in fragments between book recommendations and cups of jasmine tea, became part of my informal education in how to endure. The graduate program in counseling psychology was my first real step toward rebuilding my professional identity. I drove to classes at Northeastern 3 evenings a week, sitting among students 10 years younger who treated psychology like an academic exercise rather than a survival strategy. My papers were different from theirs, less theoretical, more rooted in the understanding that trauma was something you lived through rather than studied. Dr. Patricia Reeves, my advisor, recognized something in my approach that set me apart from traditional students. She was a woman in her 50s who'd built her career working with war veterans and domestic violence survivors, someone who understood that the best therapists often came from the ranks of people who'd fought their own battles with darkness. "You have an unusual capacity for sitting with other people's pain," she told me during one of our supervision meetings. "That's a gift, but it's also dangerous. Make sure you're healing your own wounds, not just learning to help others heal theirs." It was good advice that I sometimes followed. I went to my own therapy, processed my grief with a kind psychologist who helped me understand that losing Thomas was only part of my pain. The deeper wound was the betrayal by his family, the way they'd made me feel like my love for Thomas had been somehow fraudulent, my place in his life an elaborate mistake that his death had finally corrected. "You're grieving 2 losses, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions, the loss of your husband and the loss of your sense of belonging. The second loss is actually harder to process because it involves rejection rather than death." My thesis project focused on disenfranchised grief, the mourning that society doesn't recognize or support. I interviewed divorced spouses grieving marriages they'd loved despite their failures, estranged children mourning parents who'd rejected them, and people whose losses were deemed inappropriate by communities that preferred tidy narratives about who deserved sympathy. The research was personal in ways I didn't fully acknowledge until Dr. Reeves pointed out that I was essentially writing about my own experience. Margaret's dismissal of my grief, her insistence that strangers don't deserve to mourn, was a textbook example of how society invalidates certain kinds of loss. "Your work is groundbreaking," Dr. Reeves said as I prepared for my thesis defense, "but more importantly, it's healing. You're transforming your own experience of exclusion into a framework for helping others who've been similarly dismissed." I graduated with highest honors and immediately began building my private practice. My specialty was what I called complicated grief, situations where mourning was tangled up with guilt, rejection, betrayal, or social disapproval. Word spread quickly through Boston's therapeutic community that there was a counselor who understood the particular pain of losing someone, while simultaneously losing your place in the community that surrounded them. My clients were diverse, but shared common themes. There was Janet, whose family had disowned her after her husband's suicide, blaming her for not recognizing the signs of his depression. Michael, whose parents had written him out of their will after he came out as gay, leaving him to grieve their deaths without the comfort of inheritance or family support. Sarah, a different Sarah from my grief group friend, whose in-laws had custody of her children after her husband's overdose, forcing her to mourn both her marriage and her role as a mother simultaneously. Each client taught me something new about resilience, about the human capacity to find meaning and connection, even after devastating losses. My own experience with the Hartwells became a source of insight rather than just pain. I could recognize the signs of disenfranchised grief because I'd lived through it myself. The practice grew steadily. I moved from the studio apartment above the bookstore to a Victorian house in Somerville that I bought with savings accumulated through years of living below my means. The house needed work. The previous owner had been an elderly professor who'd let maintenance slide during his final years, but I found satisfaction in the physical labor of restoration. I learned to strip wallpaper, refinish hardwood floors, and install crown molding through YouTube videos and trial and error. Every room I completed felt like reclaiming another piece of my identity from the ashes of my life as Thomas's wife. This house was mine alone, decorated according to my taste, filled with books I'd chosen and furniture I'd saved for. The garden became my meditation space. I planted perennials that would return year after year, proof that some things endure beyond the seasons of grief. Roses for remembrance, lavender for peace, herbs for the practical magic of growing things that could be transformed into meals and healing teas. My friend Sarah from Grief Group became my chosen family, along with colleagues from my practice and neighbors who appreciated my tendency to share vegetables from my oversized garden. We created our own traditions: Thanksgiving for orphaned friends, Christmas celebrations that emphasized gratitude rather than consumption, birthday parties that honored the life we'd built rather than mourning the lives we'd lost. Dating remained complicated. I went through a phase of casual relationships with men who were attracted to my independence, but intimidated by its origins. They wanted the confident woman I'd become without engaging with the grief that had shaped me. It took several years and some spectacularly failed relationships before I understood that I needed someone who could love all of me, including the parts that were permanently marked by loss. I eventually found that with David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, a pediatric surgeon who understood both the weight of loss and the possibility of healing. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect, rather than the passionate intensity I'd shared with Thomas. It was different, but no less meaningful. Love, seasoned by experience rather than sweetened by innocence. By my 10th year post-Thomas, I'd created a life that felt authentically mine. My practice occupied the first floor of my Victorian house, allowing me to work from home while maintaining clear boundaries between personal and professional space. I'd published articles about disenfranchised grief in professional journals and spoken at conferences about the unique challenges faced by people whose losses weren't socially recognized. The irony wasn't lost on me that my exile from the Hartwell family had become the foundation for helping others navigate similar rejections. Margaret's cruelty had inadvertently given me a calling, transforming my personal trauma into professional expertise that touched hundreds of lives. I thought about Thomas daily, but no longer with the crushing weight of early grief. He'd become part of my internal landscape, a permanent presence whose memory brought comfort rather than only pain. I could visit his grave without falling apart, remember our conversations without feeling like the words were being torn from my chest. The Hartwells became background noise in my Boston life. I occasionally saw their names in society pages or charity event coverage, but they existed in a parallel universe that no longer intersected with mine. Robert had been arrested for embezzlement from a client's trust fund. Victoria had been through 2 more divorces and a stint in rehabilitation for prescription drug addiction. Jonathan's latest business venture had collapsed amid allegations of investor fraud. Margaret, according to the society gossip that filtered through my professional networks, had maintained her position as Boston's most formidable charity matriarch, despite her children's scandals. She chaired hospital boards, hosted fundraisers, and continued to live in the Beacon Hill mansion as if force of will alone could preserve the Hartwell family's social standing. I felt nothing when I heard these updates. No satisfaction at their struggles, no curiosity about their lives. They'd successfully erased me from their story, and I'd returned the favor. As far as I was concerned, the Hartwells were strangers whose paths occasionally crossed with mine, in the way that all Boston socialites occasionally intersected with the broader community, which is why, when Margaret appeared at my door that October night, 12 years after dismissing me as a stranger, my first reaction was genuine confusion. The woman standing on my front porch looked nothing like the imperious matriarch who'd reclaimed her grandmother's engagement ring and evicted me from the townhouse. This Margaret was diminished, worn down by time and circumstances I couldn't immediately identify. Her expensive clothes had been replaced by a worn coat that hung loosely on her reduced frame. Her carefully maintained hair showed gray roots, and several weeks without professional styling. Most striking were her eyes, no longer cold and calculating, but desperate in a way that suggested she'd finally encountered problems that money and social standing couldn't solve. "Claire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need your help." The decline of the Hartwell family began with small fractures that widened into chasms over the years following Thomas's death. What I learned later, through the intricate network of Boston's gossiping elite, was that my banishment had been the first in a series of decisions that revealed Margaret's fundamental misunderstanding of what held families together. Robert's gambling addiction, which had been carefully managed during Thomas's lifetime, spiraled completely out of control within 2 years of his brother's death. Without Thomas's steady influence and legal expertise to navigate his mounting debts, Robert began borrowing against family assets, forging his mother's signature on loan documents, and eventually embezzling funds from his law firm's client trust accounts. The scandal broke during Boston's social season, making headlines in both the financial pages and society columns. Robert's arrest for criminal embezzlement came complete with perp walks, federal charges, and the kind of public humiliation that old Boston families spent generations learning to avoid. Margaret's first instinct was to buy her way out of the problem. She hired the most expensive criminal defense attorney in Massachusetts, posted Robert's enormous bail, and used her charitable connections to generate character witnesses who testified to her son's previous good works. But federal prosecutors had built an airtight case, and Robert's 3-year prison sentence became the first crack in the Hartwell family's carefully maintained facade. Victoria's descent was slower, but equally devastating. Her pill addiction, which had begun with legitimate prescriptions for chronic pain following a skiing accident, evolved into a full-blown dependency that consumed increasing amounts of money and attention. She cycled through rehabilitation programs, therapists, and medical specialists, while her behavior became increasingly erratic. The final straw came when Victoria was arrested for attempting to forge a prescription at a pharmacy in Cambridge, claiming to be a different person entirely. The mugshot that appeared in the Globe showed a woman 20 years older than her actual age, hollow-eyed and desperate in a way that made her unrecognizable as the polished socialite she'd once been. Margaret spent a fortune on Victoria's legal defense and medical treatment, but addiction proved more resilient than either money or maternal determination. Victoria managed to complete court-ordered rehabilitation only to relapse within months, each cycle of recovery and relapse costing more than the last in both financial and emotional terms. Jonathan's failures were more traditionally entrepreneurial, but no less expensive. His technology startup, which had consumed $250,000 in family investment, collapsed when investigators discovered that the revolutionary software he'd promised to develop was actually stolen code from a competitor. The lawsuit that followed not only cost the family additional legal fees, but destroyed Jonathan's credibility in Boston's business community. His subsequent ventures, a high-end restaurant that closed within 6 months, a luxury car dealership that defaulted on its financing, a real estate development scheme that collapsed when environmental inspectors discovered contaminated soil, followed the same pattern of grand promises and expensive failures. By the 8th year after Thomas's death, Margaret found herself in the unfamiliar position of being financially strained. The legal fees, rehabilitation costs, bail payments, and failed investments had depleted reserves that had seemed inexhaustible when her children were younger and more stable. The first property to go was the Martha's Vineyard house, sold quietly to a family from New York who appreciated its historical significance more than its previous owners had. The proceeds helped cover Robert's latest legal appeal and Victoria's stint at an exclusive rehabilitation facility in California, but they disappeared as quickly as they'd materialized. The art collection followed piece by piece. The Monet that Thomas had loved, the Civil War artifacts his great-grandfather had collected, the antique furniture that had been in the family for generations. All of it passed through auction houses to collectors who had no emotional connection to the Hartwell family history. Margaret's charitable commitments, which had once been sources of social prestige, became financial burdens she could barely maintain. The donations that had kept her name prominently displayed on hospital wings and museum galleries were reduced to token amounts that maintained her board positions but eliminated her influence over major decisions. The social invitations that had filled her calendar for decades became less frequent as Boston's elite subtly distanced themselves from the family's scandals. Former friends who had courted her attention when she was wealthy and powerful found reasons to exclude her from gatherings where her children's legal troubles might become uncomfortable conversation topics. By the 10th year, Margaret was essentially alone in the Beacon Hill mansion, surrounded by rooms that had been emptied of their most valuable contents, maintaining appearances through force of will and dwindling savings. Robert was serving his sentence in federal prison. Victoria was living in a halfway house, struggling to maintain sobriety, while working as a receptionist at a dental office. Jonathan had moved to Florida, where he was attempting to rebuild his life away from the wreckage of his Boston reputation. The final blow came in year 11, when Margaret's own health began to fail. A routine mammogram revealed aggressive breast cancer that required immediate surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation treatments that insurance covered only partially. The medical bills, combined with her reduced ability to manage her remaining investments, pushed her from financial strain into genuine crisis. The woman who had once commanded Boston's charity circuit found herself navigating public assistance programs and medical payment plans like any other patient struggling with the intersection of serious illness and inadequate resources. The irony was devastating. Margaret Hartwell, who had spent decades raising money for cancer research, was now dependent on the very programs her charitable work had helped fund. The mansion, which had been mortgaged and remortgaged to cover her children's expenses, was finally placed on the market. But the real estate downturn had hit Boston's luxury properties particularly hard, and the house that had once been the crown jewel of Beacon Hill was now just another expensive property in a market flooded with similar homes owned by families facing similar financial pressures. Margaret moved from the master bedroom to a small guest room on the 3rd floor, closing off sections of the house to save on heating costs while she waited for a buyer who never materialized. The gardens that had been professionally maintained for decades grew wild, the wrought iron fence that surrounded the property developed rust stains, and the paint on the exterior trim began to peel in ways that advertised the family's reduced circumstances to every passerby. It was in this context, isolated, ill, financially desperate, and facing the loss of the last symbol of her family's former status, that Margaret finally swallowed her pride and remembered the daughter-in-law she'd dismissed as a stranger 12 years earlier. The woman who knocked on my door that October night was a shadow of the imperious matriarch who had humiliated me at Thomas's inheritance meeting. This Margaret Hartwell had learned what it meant to need help from people you'd previously considered beneath your notice, and the lesson had broken something fundamental in her understanding of how the world worked. "Claire," she said, her voice carrying desperation that no amount of Hartwell pride could disguise, "I need your help." The first sign that Margaret's world was truly collapsing came not from society pages or legal notices, but from an unexpected source, Mrs. Chen at the bookstore below my old apartment. I was browsing her poetry section during one of my regular visits when she mentioned seeing that elegant lady who used to come looking for you, sitting in the park across the street. "She's been there 3 days this week," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she used when discussing other people's business. "Just sitting on the bench, watching your old building. She looks diminished." I felt a chill of something that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't indifference either. Margaret Hartwell had spent 12 years ensuring that our paths never crossed, maintaining her exile of me with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to charity fundraising. For her to be lurking near my former residence suggested a level of desperation that didn't align with the woman who'd dismissed me as a stranger. "Are you sure it was her?" I asked, though Mrs. Chen's memory for faces was legendary among the neighborhood residents. "Very sure. She asked about you once, maybe 2 years ago. Wanted to know if you still lived upstairs, if you seemed well." Mrs. Chen arranged books with practiced efficiency while she spoke. "I told her you'd moved to a beautiful house and started your own business." She looked, I'm not sure how to describe it, proud, sad, perhaps both. The information unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I'd constructed my new life on the assumption that the Hartwells had erased me completely from their consciousness, that I was as invisible to them as they'd tried to make themselves to me. The idea that Margaret had been keeping track of my progress, even peripherally, suggested a complexity to our relationship that I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. 3 weeks after Mrs. Chen's observation, I encountered Margaret directly for the first time in over a decade. I was leaving Mass General after visiting a young client whose cancer treatment was progressing well, stepping out into the October afternoon sunshine, when I nearly collided with a woman emerging from the oncology building's side entrance. Recognition was mutual and instantaneous, followed by the kind of awkward pause that occurs when former enemies meet unexpectedly on neutral ground. Margaret looked terrible, not just tired or stressed, but genuinely ill in ways that expensive cosmetics couldn't disguise. Her skin had the gray pallor of someone undergoing aggressive medical treatment, and her designer coat hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight. "Claire," she said, her voice carrying none of the authority I remembered. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was visiting a client," I replied, then immediately regretted providing information she hadn't requested. Old habits of politeness died hard, even with people who'd forfeited the right to courtesy. Margaret nodded slowly, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She seemed to be cataloging changes, the confidence I'd gained, the professional success that showed in my clothing and posture, the fundamental shift from the grieving widow she'd dismissed to the self-possessed woman standing before her. "You look well," she said finally. "Successful. I'm glad." The admission seemed to cost her something significant, as if acknowledging my prosperity violated some fundamental principle she'd held about my deserved place in the world. We stood in uncomfortable silence for several seconds, two women whose shared history was too complicated for casual conversation, but too important for complete dismissal. "Margaret," I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice, "are you all right? You look—" "I'm fine," she interrupted, reflexively rejecting sympathy the way she'd once rejected my attempts at reconciliation. But then something cracked in her composure. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I'm quite ill, and She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she was about to confess weakness to someone she'd trained herself to consider an enemy. I waited, recognizing the internal struggle of someone who'd spent decades believing that admitting vulnerability was tantamount to surrender. In my practice, I'd learned that the most important gift you could give someone in crisis was simply the space to speak without judgment. "The treatment is challenging," she said finally, "and I'm doing it alone. My children are unavailable to help. The euphemism was clearly chosen to avoid admitting the full extent of Robert's, Victoria's, and Jonathan's failures. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Whatever history lay between us, watching someone face cancer alone was genuinely heartbreaking. "Is there someone, a friend, or—" Margaret's laugh was bitter enough to etch glass. "I'm discovering that many of my friendships were more transactional than I realized. People are quite busy when you can no longer host fundraisers or make substantial donations to their causes." The confession hung between us like smoke from a burned bridge. I could see in her eyes that admitting her isolation to me, the daughter-in-law she'd rejected, was almost as painful as the illness itself. "If you need someone to talk to," I began, then stopped. What was I doing? This woman had humiliated me, stolen my inheritance, made me feel like my marriage had been an elaborate mistake. Why was I offering comfort to someone who'd shown me none? But Margaret's expression of surprised gratitude answered my question. She looked at me like someone who'd been drowning and unexpectedly found a life preserver, even if it was being offered by someone she'd previously tried to push underwater. "I should go," she said, pulling her coat more tightly around her diminished frame. "But Claire, thank you for the offer. It means more than you probably realize." I watched her walk away, noting the careful pace of someone managing pain and fatigue, and realized that the emotional landscape between us had shifted in ways I wasn't ready to fully comprehend. The Margaret Hartwell who'd dismissed me as a stranger was being replaced by someone more vulnerable, more human, and infinitely more complicated to hate. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that would force me to confront the complexity of forgiveness in ways my professional training had never prepared me for. "Ms. Morrison." The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Dr. Amanda Walsh from Mass General Oncology. I'm calling about Margaret Hartwell. She's listed you as her emergency contact." My first thought was that there had been some mistake. "I think you have the wrong number. Mrs. Hartwell and I aren't—" She was very specific about the information, ma'am. "She's been admitted for complications related to her chemotherapy treatment, and she's asking for you specifically." Dr. Walsh paused. "She says you're the only family she has left." The irony was so sharp it could have drawn blood. The woman who'd declared me not family was now claiming me as her only relative. The stranger she'd dismissed was suddenly the person she called in crisis. "I'll be right there," I heard myself saying, even as my rational mind catalogued all the reasons why Margaret Hartwell's medical emergency wasn't my responsibility. But as I drove through Boston traffic toward the hospital where I'd once held Thomas while he died, I realized that some obligations transcend logic, and forgiveness isn't always about what people deserve. Sometimes it's about who we choose to become when tested by other people's failures. Margaret was about to discover whether her former daughter-in-law was capable of the grace she'd never shown, and I was about to discover whether 12 years of healing had made me strong enough to love my enemies. The October rain had been falling for 3 days, the kind of persistent autumn deluge that turns Boston streets into rivers and makes everyone question their decision to live in New England. I was in my home office, finishing notes from my final session of the day, a teenager struggling with the death of her best friend in a car accident, when the doorbell rang. It was nearly midnight. My porch light illuminated the drops of rain like tiny diamonds, but the darkness beyond made it impossible to see who might be standing at my door at such an hour. Living alone had taught me caution, and I approached the front door with the wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Through the peephole, I saw a figure hunched beneath a dark coat, face obscured by the hood pulled up against the rain. Something about the posture, defeated, exhausted, desperate, made me pause. This wasn't someone with violent intentions. This was someone who'd reached the end of whatever road they'd been traveling. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged, and found myself face to face with Margaret Hartwell. She looked nothing like the woman I'd encountered outside Mass General 6 weeks earlier. The expensive coat was soaked through, hanging like a shroud around her diminished frame. Her face was gaunt, aged by more than the 4 months since I'd last seen her, marked by the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Most shocking were her eyes, no longer cold and calculating, but hollow with desperation and something that might have been terror. "Claire," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against my porch roof. "I need your help." The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure could bear our weight. This was the woman who'd laughed at my grief, stolen my inheritance, dismissed me as a stranger unworthy of family consideration. She was standing on my doorstep at midnight, asking for help from the person she'd most thoroughly wronged. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but found only genuine desperation. Whatever had brought Margaret Hartwell to my door in the middle of a rainstorm had cost her the last of her pride, the final remnants of the armor she'd worn for 12 years of our mutual exile. "You're soaking wet," I said, removing the chain lock and stepping back. "Come inside." Margaret crossed my threshold like someone entering a foreign country, looking around the front hallway with curiosity and what might have been surprise. My home was warm, welcoming, filled with the kind of personal touches that revealed character: photographs of friends and travels, bookshelves lined with volumes on psychology and poetry, artwork from local artists whose work I'd discovered and supported. "You have a beautiful home," she said, and the sincerity in her voice suggested she was comparing it to something else, perhaps the cold perfection of the Beacon Hill mansion, or the sterile environments where she'd been spending her recent days and nights. I led her to the living room, where a fire was still crackling in the fieldstone fireplace I'd had restored during my first year in the house. Margaret stood awkwardly near the entrance, dripping rainwater onto my hardwood floors, clearly uncertain about the protocol for asking favors from people you'd previously treated as enemies. "Sit down," I said, gesturing toward the couch closest to the fire. "I'll get you some tea and a towel." When I returned from the kitchen, Margaret was sitting rigidly on the edge of the couch cushion, as if preparing to flee at the first sign of hostility. I handed her a thick towel and a mug of chamomile tea, then settled into the chair across from her, maintaining enough distance to avoid crowding someone who was clearly at the breaking point. "Tell me what's wrong," I said, using the gentle tone I employed with clients in crisis. Margaret wrapped her hands around the tea mug like it was an anchor, staring into the amber liquid, as if it contained answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, I had to lean forward to hear her. "I'm dying," she said simply. "The cancer has metastasized. My oncologist says I have maybe 3 months, possibly less." She looked up at me then, and her eyes held the terrible clarity that comes with absolute certainty about one's fate. "I have no money left for experimental treatments, no family members capable of caring for me, and nowhere to go when they discharge me from the hospital." The information hit me like cold water. Whatever I'd expected Margaret to say, it wasn't this stark recitation of medical and financial catastrophe. The woman who'd once commanded Boston's charity circuit was facing death alone, and broke, reduced to seeking help from the daughter-in-law she'd dismissed as unworthy of consideration. "What about your children?" I asked, though her earlier comment about their unavailability suggested I already knew the answer. "Robert is in federal prison until next year. Victoria is in court-ordered rehabilitation, and even if she were available, her addiction makes her unsuitable as a caregiver." Margaret's voice carried the flat affect of someone reciting facts that had already inflicted their maximum emotional damage. "Jonathan moved to Miami and made it quite clear that he considers my situation to be the natural consequence of my poor financial management." The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of us. Margaret had raised 3 children, who were now incapable of providing the most basic filial support, while the daughter-in-law she'd rejected was sitting in a comfortable home, successful and stable, listening to her pleas for help. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the words she'd clearly rehearsed during her journey through the rain to my doorstep. "I know I treated you terribly after Thomas died. I know I was cruel, vindictive, and completely unjust in how I handled his estate and your place in our family." She paused, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since entering my home. "But you're the only person I know who has both the resources and the character to help someone who doesn't deserve help. And I'm desperate enough to ask for charity from the woman I wronged most deeply." The admission hung between us like a confession, stark in its honesty and devastating in its implications. Margaret Hartwell was essentially acknowledging that her cruelty to me had been wrong, that her treatment of my grief had been indefensible, and that her dismissal of my place in Thomas's life had been both unjust and ultimately self-destructive. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she was asking and what her request revealed about both of our journeys over the past 12 years. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on my windows, providing a soundtrack for one of the most surreal conversations of my life. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, carrying none of the anger or satisfaction that Margaret might have expected from someone being asked to rescue their former tormentor. "I'll help you," I said simply. Margaret's face crumpled with relief so profound it was painful to witness. Years of pride, anger, and careful emotional control collapsed in an instant, leaving behind only a dying woman who'd found unexpected grace in the last place she'd thought to look for it. But there was something else I needed to say, something that had been growing in my chest since she'd appeared at my door with her desperate request. "There's just one thing, Margaret. Before we go any further, there's something you need to know about Thomas's death, something that changes everything between us." Her face went white, and I realized that my words had touched whatever secret she'd been carrying for 12 years, the guilt that had driven her to reject me so completely after Thomas's funeral. "Claire, I don't think—" "Yes," I said firmly. "You do think. You've been thinking about it for 12 years, and it's time we both said it out loud." Margaret's tea mug slipped from her trembling hands, shattering against my hardwood floor in a spray of chamomile-scented porcelain. Neither of us moved to clean it up. We sat frozen in the terrible moment before truth emerges, when secrets that have festered in darkness are finally dragged into the light. "I know what you're going to say," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "And I can't bear to hear it." "You called him that morning," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "The morning he died. You told me yourself, at the hospital. You said he was coming to see you about something important." Margaret's face had gone completely white, her lips pressed together so tightly they'd disappeared entirely. She was holding herself rigidly, as if movement might cause her to completely disintegrate. "Margaret," I continued, my therapist training helping me maintain calm in the face of her obvious distress. "What did you need to tell Thomas that was so urgent it couldn't wait? For 12 years, I'd believed that Thomas's death was simply a cruel accident, a moment of inattention, a truck driver's fatigue, the random violence that takes good people for no reason at all. But Margaret's guilt at the hospital, her immediate transformation from tentative acceptance to complete rejection, had planted seeds of doubt that had grown slowly over the years. "I was going to tell him about Robert," she said finally, the words emerging like shards of glass. "About the money Robert had been stealing from the family accounts, about the gambling debts he'd hidden, about the loan he'd taken out using Thomas's name as a co-signer without Thomas's knowledge." My blood turned to ice water. Thomas didn't know? Robert forged his signature, used Thomas's excellent credit and spotless reputation to secure loans he never intended to repay. Margaret's voice was hollow, empty of everything except the weight of carried secrets. "I discovered it the week before the accident. Bank statements, loan documents, evidence that Robert had been systematically defrauding his own family for months. I felt the room spinning around me as the implications became clear. You were going to ask Thomas to cover Robert's debts. I was going to ask him to use his inheritance, the house, the trust fund his grandfather left him, to save his brother from prison." Margaret's words came faster now, as if a dam had burst inside her chest. "I knew Thomas would do it. He was always the good son, always willing to sacrifice himself for family loyalty. I knew he'd give up everything to protect Robert." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. "And you couldn't live with that knowledge after he died." "I killed him," Margaret said, the words emerging as a sob. "I called him that morning and asked him to come see me, knowing I was going to ask him to give up his future to save his worthless brother. If I hadn't called, if I'd just let Robert face the consequences of his actions, Thomas would have lived. He'd be alive today, and you two would have had the life you deserved." The confession hit me like a physical blow. For 12 years I'd carried the pain of losing Thomas and the additional wound of Margaret's rejection. I'd built my understanding of her cruelty on the assumption that grief had made her temporarily insane, that she'd eventually realize her mistake and perhaps attempt reconciliation. Instead, I was learning that her treatment of me had been driven by guilt so profound it had consumed her capacity for rational thought. She'd rejected me not because she blamed me for Thomas's death, but because she blamed herself and couldn't bear to be reminded of the consequences of her request. "You pushed me away because you couldn't stand to look at me," I said, the realization forming as I spoke. "Because I represented everything Thomas would never have." "You were his future," Margaret said, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. "You were the life he was building, the family he was creating, the happiness he deserved. Every time I looked at you, I saw what I'd stolen from him with my selfishness." I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where rain continued its assault on the glass. My mind was reeling, trying to process not just the revelation about the circumstances of Thomas's death, but the complete recontextualization of everything that had happened afterward. "So, you decided I was a stranger," I said, turning back to face her. "You decided I didn't deserve anything from his estate, because you couldn't bear to give me the life he'd intended for us to share." "I was protecting myself," Margaret admitted. "If I acknowledged that you were his real family, if I honored his wishes about your inheritance, I'd have to face what I'd done. I'd have to accept that my selfishness had killed my own son." The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain and Margaret's quiet sobbing. I stood by the window, processing 12 years of pain and anger through the lens of this new information. Everything I'd believed about Margaret's motivations had been wrong. Her cruelty hadn't been rooted in snobbery or class prejudice. It had been a desperate attempt to escape the crushing weight of her own guilt. "Did you save Robert?" I asked finally. Margaret's laugh was bitter enough to etch glass. "No. I couldn't bring myself to ask that sacrifice of anyone else, even after Thomas was gone. Robert went to prison, just as he would have if Thomas had lived. My son died for nothing." I returned to my chair, studying Margaret's face as she wept for losses that compound interest had been accumulating for over a decade. She looked smaller somehow, as if confessing her secret had physically diminished her. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I'm dying," she said simply, "and because you deserve to know that Thomas's death wasn't random. You deserve to understand why I treated you so terribly. You deserve to know that none of it was your fault." She paused, wiping her eyes with the towel I'd given her for drying her rain-soaked hair. "And because I need you to forgive me before I die, not for my sake, I don't deserve forgiveness, but because carrying this much anger and pain will eventually destroy you the way it destroyed me. I've spent 12 years hating myself for what I did to Thomas and to you. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life hating me." I sat in the silence that followed her plea, feeling the weight of choice settling on my shoulders. Margaret Hartwell was asking me to forgive the unforgivable, not just her treatment of me, but her role in the chain of events that had led to Thomas's death. She was asking me to choose grace over justice, mercy over the satisfaction of watching her suffer as she'd made me suffer. The rain continued outside, washing the world clean while we sat surrounded by the debris of secrets finally spoken aloud. In 3 months, maybe less, Margaret would be dead. The question was, who did I want to be in the time she had left? The answer, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. I didn't answer Margaret immediately. Instead, I cleaned up the broken tea mug, made fresh tea for both of us, and built up the fire that had begun to die down during our conversation. Margaret watched these ordinary domestic actions with the intensity of someone who'd forgotten what normal kindness looked like. When I finally settled back into my chair, I could see that she'd used the time to prepare herself for rejection. Her shoulders were squared despite her exhaustion, her chin lifted in a gesture that reminded me of the imperious woman who'd dismissed me at Thomas's inheritance meeting. She was ready to accept whatever punishment I chose to deliver. "I forgive you," I said simply. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched Margaret's carefully constructed defenses crumble like sand castles at high tide. She hadn't expected grace, had prepared herself for anger, accusations, perhaps the kind of cruel dismissal she'd once given me. My forgiveness hit her with the force of the unexpected. "You can't," she whispered. "You don't understand what I understand perfectly," I interrupted. "You made a choice to protect Robert at Thomas's expense. That choice led to Thomas's death. You then made a second choice to protect yourself from guilt by punishing me for surviving when he didn't. Both choices were wrong, and both caused tremendous pain." Margaret flinched as if I'd struck her, but I continued in the same gentle tone. "But understanding doesn't mean I have to spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of your mistakes. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, Margaret. It's about what I need to do to remain whole." She stared at me with something approaching wonder, as if I'd performed an impossible magic trick. "How?" she asked. "How can you forgive me when I can't forgive myself?" "Because I learned something during the years after Thomas died," I said. "Anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I spent 3 years hating you before I realized that the hatred was destroying me, not you. Forgiveness wasn't a gift I gave you. It was a gift I gave myself." I paused, sipping my tea while I gathered the words for what I needed to say next. "But there's something else, Margaret. Something you need to understand about Thomas's death." Her face went pale again, bracing for another revelation. "Thomas would have helped Robert," I said. "You're absolutely right about that. He would have mortgaged the house, liquidated his trust fund, spent every penny he had to keep his brother out of prison, and he would have done it gladly, because that's who Thomas was." Margaret nodded miserably. "That's why I can't forgive myself. I knew he'd sacrifice everything for family." "But you're missing the point," I said gently. "Thomas didn't die because you asked him to make that sacrifice. He died because a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. The accident would have happened whether he was driving to your house, or to the grocery store, or to meet me for lunch. The timing was coincidental, not causal." I could see Margaret struggling to process this distinction. 12 years of self-imposed guilt, warring with the possibility that her burden might be lighter than she'd believed. "You're saying his death wasn't my fault?" she asked tentatively. "I'm saying that bad things happen to good people for reasons that have nothing to do with our choices," I replied. "Thomas died in a random accident. Yes, your call put him on that highway at that moment, but 1,000 other factors contributed to the collision. The truck driver's fatigue, the weather conditions, the timing of traffic lights. None of those were under your control." Margaret was crying again, but these tears seemed different. Not the harsh sobs of confession, but the gentler weeping of someone beginning to release a burden they'd carried too long. "I've spent 12 years believing I murdered my own son," she whispered. "And I've spent 12 years believing you hated me for no reason," I replied. "We've both been carrying pain that was heavier than it needed to be." I stood up and moved to the couch beside her, close enough to offer comfort without crowding her diminished space. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. Thomas loved Robert despite his flaws. He would have wanted you to try to save him. The fact that you were willing to ask for help for your troubled son doesn't make you a monster. It makes you a mother." "But I was going to ask him to give up everything," Margaret protested. "His house, his inheritance, his security. Which he would have given gladly, I said firmly. And then he would have come home to me, and we would have figured out how to rebuild together. Thomas didn't define himself by his possessions, Margaret. He defined himself by his relationships, his work, his ability to help people who needed help. You weren't asking him to sacrifice his identity. You were giving him an opportunity to live it. Margaret leaned against the couch cushions, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had sustained her through her midnight confession. I don't know how to stop hating myself for what I did to you. The same way you learn to forgive anyone, I said. One day at a time, one choice at a time, until grace becomes a habit instead of an effort. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the rain outside gentling to a steady patter that sounded more peaceful than threatening. The fire crackled softly, and I found myself thinking about the strange circular nature of grief and healing. I have a proposal, I said finally. Margaret looked at me with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected offers. You said you have 3 months, maybe less. You also said you have nowhere to go and no one to care for you. I paused, making sure I had her full attention. Move in here. Let me take care of you. Her eyes widened with shock. Claire, I couldn't possibly— Yes, you could, I interrupted. I have a guest room that's never used. I work from home so I can be available when you need help. And frankly, I think we both need to rewrite the ending of our story. I don't understand. For 12 years, our relationship has been defined by Thomas's death and the pain that followed, I explained. We've been frozen in that moment of loss and anger, never getting the chance to discover who we might be to each other if we weren't trapped by grief and guilt. Margaret shook her head slowly. After everything I've done to you, why would you want that? Because Thomas loved us both, I said simply. And because I think he'd be heartbroken to know that his death divided the 2 women he cared about most. Maybe it's time we honored his memory by learning to care about each other. I could see her struggling with the concept, her ingrained pride warring with her desperate need for connection in her final months. I don't have any money to pay you, she said quietly. The medical bills, the legal fees, I'm not asking for money, I interrupted. I'm asking for a chance to heal something that's been broken for too long. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if it might contain answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I had to lean closer to hear her. What if I die angry? She asked. What if I can't learn to forgive myself? What if I spend my last months being bitter and difficult and impossible to live with? I smiled, recognizing the fear beneath her practical concerns. Then I'll take care of you anyway. That's what family does, Margaret. Real family. Not the kind that's defined by blood or law, but the kind that's chosen through love and commitment and the decision to show up for each other when it's hard. Is that what we are? She asked wonderingly. Family? I think we always were, I said. We just got lost for a while. 2 hours later, I helped Margaret from my couch to the guest room upstairs, supporting her fragile weight as she climbed stairs that would soon become impossible for her to navigate alone. The room was simple but comfortable, with windows that faced east toward the sunrise and bookshelves filled with novels that might distract her during sleepless nights. This is beautiful, she said, running her hand over the quilt my grandmother had made decades earlier. Thank you, Claire, for all of it. As I was leaving her to rest, Margaret called my name softly. Yes, Thomas would be proud of you, she said. The woman you've become, the life you've built, the grace you've shown me tonight. He would be so proud. I paused in the doorway, feeling tears prick at my eyes for the first time since Margaret had appeared on my doorstep. He'd be proud of you too, I said, for having the courage to ask for help, and for trusting me with the truth. It takes strength to let people see you when you're broken. 3 months later, Margaret died in the hospice bed we'd set up in the living room so she could watch the garden through the front windows. She died surrounded by people who'd learned to love her in her final weeks. My friend Sarah, who'd helped with medical appointments. David Chen, who'd made her laugh with his terrible puns. Mrs. Chen, who'd brought soup and stories from the bookstore. Her children came for the funeral. Robert, released on compassionate leave from federal prison, wept like a man finally understanding the cost of his choices. Victoria, 6 months sober and working at maintaining sobriety one day at a time, spoke about the mother she'd rediscovered in Margaret's final months. Jonathan flew in from Miami, subdued and respectful in ways that suggested he'd learned something about the difference between pride and dignity. At Margaret's request, we held the service at the small chapel where Thomas and I had been married. She'd asked to be buried beside him in the cemetery where his grandfather rested, reuniting a family that had been fractured by pride and poor choices, but ultimately healed through the radical decision to choose love over judgment. I inherited Margaret's remaining possessions. Not much, given the financial devastation of her final years, but enough to matter. Among her papers, I found Thomas's original will, the one written before his death, leaving everything to me with provisions for his mother's care and his siblings' support. Margaret had hidden it for 12 years, unable to honor his wishes, but also unable to destroy his final expression of love. There was also a letter, written in Margaret's shaking handwriting during her final week. Claire, thank you for showing me what family actually means. Thank you for teaching me that forgiveness is not about deserving grace, but about choosing to extend it anyway. Thank you for letting a bitter old woman learn to love properly before she died. You gave me the gift of Thomas's memory without the burden of guilt. You gave me a peaceful death surrounded by people who cared about me. Most importantly, you gave me the chance to see that love is always stronger than the mistakes we make in its name. The house on Beacon Hill has finally sold. The proceeds, after medical bills, amount to about $200,000. I'm leaving it all to your practice, to help other families heal from the kind of wounds that nearly destroyed us. Use it to prove that broken things can be made whole again. With love and gratitude, Margaret P.S. There's one more thing in my jewelry box. I think you'll know what to do with it. In the bottom of Margaret's jewelry box, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled of lavender, I found my grandmother's engagement ring, the Cartier piece Thomas had given me, the one Robert had reclaimed at the inheritance meeting 12 years earlier. I slipped it back onto my finger where it belonged, feeling the weight of promises kept and love that endures beyond death, beyond mistakes, beyond the human capacity for both cruelty and grace. That evening, I sat in my garden among the roses and herbs I'd planted during my years of healing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. David was inside, preparing dinner and humming off key while he cooked. Sarah was coming over later with wine and terrible movies that would make us laugh until our sides hurt. My life was full, rich with connections that had been chosen rather than inherited, strengthened by adversity rather than weakened by it. I'd learned that family isn't about blood or law or social position. It's about showing up for each other, especially when showing up is difficult. Thomas's memory lived on, not in the possessions his family had fought over, but in the love I carried forward, the healing I facilitated for other families, and the radical choice to forgive, even when forgiveness seemed impossible. Some storms destroy everything in their path, others clear the air and make space for new growth. Margaret's appearance at my door that rainy October night had been both a storm that destroyed our old resentments and made space for an unexpected grace that transformed us both. As the stars emerged above my garden, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for the courage to choose love over revenge, and for the mysterious ways that broken hearts can learn to beat in harmony again. The stranger who'd knocked on my door in desperation had become family before she died, and in saving her, I'd discovered that salvation is never a one-way transaction. We heal others by allowing ourselves to be healed. We offer grace by learning to receive it, and we become family by choosing to love even when love seems impossible. That, I realized, was Thomas's true inheritance, not money or possessions, but the capacity to transform pain into compassion, loss into love, and strangers into family through the simple revolutionary act of forgiveness. The rain had stopped, the storm was over, and we were home.